This is part two of an intended three-part discussion on the building located at 112 through 118 West Main Street in Troy, Ohio. This part will focus on the National Register of Historic Places and Troy. Prior to the bicentennial, the State of Ohio's Historic Preservation Office made a concerted effort across the state to inventory historic buildings. Nearly all the buildings in Troy that have had a historic building inventory conducted were accomplished at this time. Copies of the building inventories, now known as the Ohio Historic Inventory Form, can be found at the City of Troy and the Troy-Miami County Library. These bicentennial inventories were conducted by Loren Gannon, who at the time not only taught history at the University of Dayton, but also worked for the State Historic Preservation Office. Mr. Gannon was a friend of mine. We served together on the Board of Trustees for the Landmarks Foundation of Centerville, Washington Township for 15 years. Out of the many buildings inventoried by Mr. Gannon, only 7 buildings were able to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Public Square Historic District also submitted and eventually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Public Square Historic District is a very limited area. It is bound by Water Street, Cherry Street, Franklin Street, and Mulberry Street. Having historic building inventory completed for a building is the first step to getting a building or a district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Once that is accomplished, the next step is to complete the State Historic Preservation Office's preliminary questionnaire. There are 3 critical questions that need to be answered in the positive for any building to be considered. These questions are listed with the answers that I would provide as an expert in historic preservation. Question 1. Is your building at least 50 years old? Considering that the major renovations additions completed by the Oddfellows in 1902, 1903, I think we can answer yes. The next question, does it still have historical integrity, important aspects of its original appearance and character? Before we answer this question, the term historical integrity should be defined. This refers to how much of the original building or building fabric is still present, how important architectural features have been removed. A local example might be of assistance in clarifying this issue. The loss of historic integrity impeded the old Trinity Episcopal Church at 22 West Main Street from being listed on the National Register. In 1972, Mr. Gannon completed a historic building inventory on the church. Mr. Gannon also prepared an application for the building to be listed on the National Register. However, it was determined by the State Historic Preservation Office that so much of the building's fabric had been removed that it was not eligible for the listing. In conducting research for a previous owner, I contacted the State Preservation Office. They looked into their files and confirmed that the building was rejected by staff for inclusion to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1955, serious structural issues were observed in Trinity Episcopal Church, which resulted in the belfry being removed. This information can be found in the official history of the church. The removal of the bell tower was enough to keep the building from being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Furthermore, according to local historian Thomas Wheeler, the original interior of the church was based on the classical New England meeting house. Those interior features were removed during the 19th century. You may remember a few years ago, local historian and preservation-minded individuals made a commotion about the church's possible demise. They claimed the building should be on the National Register. The fact was, and the fact still is, that so much of this building has been altered that it is not eligible for historic status at the state or national level. So this brings us back to question 2. Does the Oddfellows building still have historical integrity? Possibly yes, definitely no. For the 1841 courthouse, we must answer no. As previously discussed, the Greek Revival facade, which was the only architecturally significant feature of the building, was completely destroyed. Using the proper terminology, the building, or concealed fragment, has lost its historical integrity. What little of the historic building remains is concealed by the subsequent construction, and the interior has been totally altered. For the Oddfellows building, we can answer possibly yes. The West Main Street facade has been altered over the years. In particular, the large glass storefront for 118 West Main Street has seriously altered the first floor elevation. Other modern materials such as doors and windows have been installed to replace original features. These changes could affect getting the building listed individually. However, it could, be considered a supporting structure within a larger historical district. Question 3, and probably the most difficult for people to understand, is it significant local, state, or national history? There's actually 3 criteria to look at. My answer to this is no. We would have difficulty discussing how significant the building is to any level of history as an Oddfellows building. Nothing of importance is known to have occurred here. And from my observations, the upper floor of the building have not been occupied since the Oddfellows abandoned the building in the 1930s. Local historians have not presented any documented proof that any events of historical importance affecting local, state, or national importance occurred since the building was constructed in 1902. So here would be a building that would be considered, or a location that would be important for historical designation, and that would be the Huffman Prairie at the Wright brothers did their preliminary flight studies. While some historians will point to the black laws requiring blacks to register and pay an exorbitant amount of money to be allowed to settle in Miami County, $500, which equates to more than $18,000 in 2023, this was a law that affected the entire state of Ohio. It may be difficult to convince the State Preservation Office that this concealed fragment of a building holds importance over any other county courthouse that might still exist from the period. Furthermore, there is criteria that a single short visit to a building does not make it historical. The 2 trials mentioned by local historians, while interesting, do not have an impact or significance to the development of Troy. There's a high bar for a building to be considered historic for association with events and people. As stated by the National Register Bulletin, How to Apply the National Register Criteria for Evaluation, quote, a basic integrity test for a property associated with an important event or person is whether a historical contemporary would recognize the property as it exists today, unquote. In other words, if any Randolph free person or convicted murderer George Mitchell were to visit the building today, would they recognize the property? Per the Secretary of Interior, that includes interiors as well as exteriors. More importantly, and we can't stress this enough, the 1841 courthouse has lost its integrity as defined by question 2. So a good example of this is President Bush enjoying a dinner at the Pine Club would not make the Pine Club a historical building. However, the little 1959 Yuba Ranch in Centerville, Ohio, where Irma Baumbach began her nationally syndicated column at Wits End, was eligible, and in fact, Mr. Gannon and I worked together to get that building placed on the National Register. Again, would any of the Randolph Free people or George Mitchell, the murderer, recognize the old courthouse in its current condition? Some might try to say the building's architecture would qualify it for the National Register. There is a criteria for buildings that have, quote, distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, represents the work of a master, possesses high artistic values, unquote. In my expert opinion, The Oddfellows building does not have the architectural qualities that would afford it inclusion. It is not an exemplary example of Richardsonian Romanesque, as some have stated. The Fort Piqua Hotel is an exemplary example. The now lost Edwards School was an exemplary example of Richardsonian Romanesque. The Oddfellows building is a weak attempt to use arched entry features and a window pattern to provide the building some reference to the style. Furthermore, the use of Richardsonian Romanesque as a style was waning by 1903. To state it bluntly, the Oddfellows building was a half-hearted attempt completed by an unknown designer. The State Preservation Office's preliminary questionnaire bluntly states, quote, if your answer to one or more of these above questions is no, the property is unlikely to be eligible for listing among the National Register of Historic Places, and you need not fill out the rest of this form. While the Oddfellows building with its concealed fragments of the 1841 courthouse is an important element of the urban fabric of West Main Street, it does not rise to the standards outlined by the Secretary of the Interior to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This, however, does not preclude the building from being renovated or adapted for a new use.